Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh, and a very good evening back to our guest of honor tonight, Yang Berhormat Datuk Sri Anwar Ibrahim, Member of Parliament Malaysia. Thank you so much, Datuk Sri, for investing your time to be with us here today, insyaAllah. Yang berbahagia, Associate Professor Dr. Zulkifli Hassan, Deputy Director of Student Development and Community Engagement, National Islamic University Malaysia, the man behind this program. Thank you for making it possible, Doctor. And also our very own brother Amin Azim Taharuddin, the President of IIUM Student Union. And not to forget all of the audience, brothers and sisters of IIUM that are with us tonight, even though the campus is off, inshallah the spirit of IIUM Student Union and the spirit of IIUM itself will always be enlightened, even using online platform. Now, we also get to know that this talk tonight are open to the public. So thank you to members of the public who are with us tonight. My name is Farida Halim binti Buhari. I am the third year student of Ahmad Ibrahim, Kuliah of Law, and also currently serving as the assistant in public relations and advocacy at IIUM Student Union. Before we begin this exciting and fruitful discussion, let us all give a tribute to almarhum, the Royal Professor Dr. Ungku Aziz Abdul Aziz bin Ungku Abdul Hamid. So let us all recite the Al-Fatihah and pray that menebang si pohon jati, papan dijawar, dibelah-belah. Kalaulah hidup tidak berbudi, umpama pokok tidak berbuah. Now, I purposely cite this pantun because it portrays the man of the topic tonight very well. He is the man of deeds that left so many contributions, or in this pantun, he left so many budi to people around him, to the country in general, and his contribution is followed by everyone around the world, especially the Islamic community. And also he is a man who has deep love for culture, including pantun, Malay ghazal, and you see if you read his biography, he has so much love for Malay literature. And tonight, we are talking about none other than the almarhum Royal Professor Dr. Ungku Abdul Aziz bin Ungku Abdul Hamid, or famously known as Pak Ungku. And tonight with me, I am very humbled to be able to have this discussion about this late Pak Ungku with no less of a figure, the man that does not need an introduction, the reformist and intellectual, the man of the hour. I am with the Datuk Sri Anwar Ibrahim himself. Now, before we begin, I would like to invite the President of IIUM Student Union to give his speech.
Okay, Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Thank you, Sister Moderator. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Yang berhormat Datuk Sri Anwar Ibrahim, Member of Parliament of Malaysia. Yang berbahagia Associate Professor Dr. Zulkifli Hassan, Deputy Director Student Development and Community Engagement, International Islamic University Malaysia. And also not to forget brothers and sisters and those who joined our sessions tonight. First of all, I would like to thank YB Dr. Sri Anwar Ibrahim for joining us today as the guest of honor of these sessions. And also our Deputy Director for managing and also organizing these sessions and involving us, the Student Union, to be part of these sessions. In the year of 1960, Student Union was introduced and established in Malaysia. Thereof, we can see how the spirits of academic freedoms and autonomy was being practiced in Malaysia. Prominent figures like Professor Hong Kim Hong and Syed Hamid Ali stands as the pioneers of this student body, the Union. Nevertheless, gloomy days start to emerge as student activism became regressive due to Baling event in 1971, or known as Peristiwa Baling 1971. It is the same year University and University College Act was being implemented, or well known as AUKU. Students continued to live in fear culture, having their voice being silenced and be suppressed to fight for the student rights. The next 40 years witnessed how students was enforced to live in the same cycle, but now in the late 2019 and also 2020, with the introductions of the student union, we might have will be see changes in the future of student empowerment. In the long fight of student rights, hereby we are remembered of the sacrifices by student leaders like Datuk Sri Anwar Ibrahim here as our panelists, and also our honorable guest and Syed Hamid Ali, and also not to forget our Professor Emeritus Tan Sri Dr. Zulkifli Abdul Razak, our rector of the International Islamic University Malaysia, who was once the president of the USM Student Union. Tonight, we'll be on a journey to discuss about prominent figure Bespoke, a man who made progressive moves in the archipelago, an economist, a profound statesman, an educationist respected in the world of academia who inspires the young generations, and more to come. He is also an idealist and a realist. Too many contributions there is by our almarhum Royal Professor Ungku Aziz in the development and empowerment of students in the golden age of him as a Vice Chancellor of University of Malaya, UM, in addition to pioneering the establishment of Tabung Haji as profound body that dignify Muslim in Malaysia nowadays. It is my deepest hope that my fellow friends, brothers and sisters that join tonight to garner as many insights and inputs delivered by YB Datuk Sri Anwar Ibrahim in discussing the world of our late Royal Professor Ungku Aziz. Tonight, we shall be on board to find the hidden gem of our country distinguished figures. We present to you these sessions. Thank you, and Assalamu alaikum warahmatullahi ta'ala wabarakatuh.
Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Thank you so much, Brother Amin Azim. Now we move forward. We would like to welcome Dr. Zulkifli Hassan for his speech.
Yeah, Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Thank you very much to Sister Farida Hanim, our distinguished guests yang berhormat Datuk Sri Anwar Ibrahim, Members of Parliament of Malaysia, Brother Amir Nazim Kaharudin, President IIUM Student Union, ladies and gentlemen, brothers and sisters. Once again, Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Salam sejahtera and very good evening. First and foremost, I would like to warmly welcome and to graciously extend our utmost gratitude to Yang Berhormat Datuk Sri Anwar Ibrahim and all to this webinar organized by IIUM Student Union in collaboration with GamesMy Esport. This webinar series aims at providing a platform for knowledge sharing and for the meeting of the intellectual minds on student development related topics. I'm very honored to witness this historic moment, embarking our dialogue on the intellectual thought of the Renaissance man, Professor Ungku Aziz. To Yang Berhormat Datuk Sri Anwar Ibrahim, we are deeply honored to have you as our guest of honor today, and we are indeed humbled by your concern and kindness to accept our invitation. Our deepest appreciation for your graciousness in attending this webinar despite your busy schedule. Ladies and gentlemen, brothers and sisters, actually Yang Berhormat Datuk Sri Anwar Ibrahim is very instrumental to International Islamic University Malaysia. On 17 July 1988, Datuk Sri Anwar Ibrahim, as the Minister of Education during that time, was appointed as the second president of the International Islamic University Malaysia until 1999. Yang Berhormat Datuk Sri Anwar Ibrahim has certainly contributed significantly to the developments of IIUM. Thank you very much, Datuk Sri. May Allah bless you and family. Yang Berhormat Datuk Sri, ladies and gentlemen, brothers and sisters, Professor Ungku Aziz was an eminent academic who dedicated his life of research for the betterment of society. He was the first Malaysian longest-serving Vice Chancellor of University Malaya and the sole person to have been accorded the status of the Royal Professor in the country. Professor Ungku Aziz will be remembered by many for the contributions that he has given to the nations. His services and sacrifices will always remain in the hearts and minds of every Malaysian. It is truly an outstanding honor and privilege for us to have Yang Berhormat Datuk Sri Anwar Ibrahim, a major international figure and one of the most influential contemporary scholars, to have conversation with us to talk and to speak about Professor Ungku Aziz. The man the man who wrote the Asian Renaissance, will speak about the true Renaissance man. Interestingly, Professor Ungku Aziz in his foreword in the book Mahasiswa Menggugat, written by Professor Muhammad Abu Bakar, that was first published in 1973, mentioned that two persons that he hoped would write their autobiography. They are Syed Hamid Ali and Yang Berhormat Datuk Sri Anwar Ibrahim. With this, I personally believe that Datuk Sri Anwar Ibrahim is the right person to share with us, especially to the students, leaders, to the student activists, about the personality, the intellectual thought of Professor Ungku Aziz. May his life and great achievement set an example and inspiration to us, to young and future generations. Yang Berhormat, ladies and gentlemen, brothers and sisters, I hope that my thoughts have provided some context to the discourse. I look forward to the discussion ahead, and I wish everyone a very productive dialogue. May Allah bless you all. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Waalaikumsalam warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. May Allah bless you too, Doctor. Thank you so much. Now, with the end of Doctor's speech, now is the moment that we've all been waiting for. I will now change my role from an MC to just a curious student hoping to get all the untold stories and inspiration from the man before me. We welcome Yang Berhormat Datuk Sri Anwar Ibrahim to this online table of ours. Now, how are you, Datuk Sri? Alhamdulillah. Thank you so much. Despite your busy schedule, you still take the time to be with us students today. We appreciate it very much, and hopefully everyone can benefit from this discussion. Now, after the late Pak Ungku left us on the 15th December 2020, Malaysia has lost the best national treasure, the thinker, the doer, the Renaissance man of Malaysia, and I would dare to even say globally. But although every man is destined to live when the time has come, their idea and contribution should last for generations. Hence why we think that this topic and discussion should carry forward. Now, he is known as the man of all seasons, the wise guru, the epitome of Malaysian intellectual, and more. So if you, Datuk Sri, could give him an introduction, how would you describe him, and what exactly about him that you wish to be highlighted?
Right. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Thank you, Moderator Farida Hanum, President Amin Azim, and distinguished Deputy Rector Zulkifli Hassan, and friends who follow this session. Let me at the outset confess that I admire the Ungku Aziz immensely as a scholar, as a teacher. I also created lots of problems for him. He had to deal with these angry students, protests, and there's the age of students' unrest. He happens to be a vice chancellor. There were strong disagreements with him. So I'm going to give a very objective account in brief on this towering figure, a phenomenal influence in our Malaysian society, economy and politics. Now, we in our generation see Ungku Aziz as the champion of the downtrodden, the poor, the marginalized. His Rencana Kemiskinan, this series of articles, to me was virtually, it's a simple, not too academic in a thesis, but an account of his personal experience in Kemaman, in Mersing, for example, which is like a tour de force. People talk about the greatness of the country, the potential of Malaya at that time as an independent entity, but he then challenged some strong notions about development, about the progress that we claim to achieve, and say, look, there are questions that must be addressed. Grinding poverty among the mixed, particularly among the rural Malays, and this must be addressed. we virtually memorized the entire thesis about lack of capital, poor marketing, or he termed it as irregularities in the marketing infrastructure. And then, of course, the issue of middlemen, exploitation, and it also relates to the issue of land. He then introduced us to the great names. So Emerson used to say, to understand a great Renaissance figure, you must also know what he reads or what he read. Of course, it's a very wide range of interests, from the Malay classics, which I must also commend his wife, who was had an immense influence because of her interest in culture, the arts, and Malay classics. And of course, the Mathnawi of Rumi, Ibn Khaldun's Muqaddimah, other than, of course, the great economic theories. He introduced us to Samir Amin, the more left of center scholar. Introduced us to the efforts of Said Mare, who introduced major land reform in Egypt. So once he introduced these names, we had to then go to the library, get the books, and try and understand and grasp. So Ungku Aziz, in his Rencana Kemiskinan, was of course subtly critical of the establishment. He made reference to those who were great bankers. At that time, his daughter was not a central banker, but that he was telling the bankers, the economists, the top bureaucrats, the leaders who talk about figures and success stories, but sometimes fail to understand and grasp. There's a disconnect between the stark realities on the ground. So that was Ungku Aziz in the realm of economics, which I think, even personally, I must say that my initial encounter with him was always to hear him talking about poverty, about the downtrodden, about the marginalized, about the poor. And he, greatness of Ungku Aziz, he never took it as a racial equation. It was always poverty irrespective of race and creed. And but naturally, at that time, Malaya, we face this issue of grinding poverty in the rural sector. Now, then you talk about the Renaissance man. I mean, of course, there is a book published on Ungku Aziz by Professor Bakar Hamid, his colleague, and of course, Professor Literature, K.T. Joseph, and others. And there's, of course, the whole collections of his writings. So I'm a great fan. You can see virtually his writings, which is also one major, I think, contribution to Ungku Aziz is his Jejak di Partai Zaman, Footprints in the Sense of Time, which to me, I would say, both Rencana Kemiskinan in Bahasa and Footprint, which is also in English, both English and Malay, Jejak, must be compulsory reading, to my mind, to understand the society, the grievances, the problems, and the Malay mind, and the challenges that we face as a country. And the more relevant in this Jejak or Footprints, because he articulated some views exalted by personalities like Za'ba, Zainal Abidin bin Ahmad, a great literary giant and a thinker, who also initially talked about poverty. And Za'ba, of course, to my mind, is unique because he referred to poverty as poverty in terms of material requirements, poverty of the mind, poverty in character and akhlaq. So he extended the meaning of poverty. I got much closer to Naqib Al-Atas. And it is interesting that one of the great works of Naqib is to introduce what he referred to as the oldest known Malay manuscript, a 16th century Malay translation of the Aqaid of Nasafi. But interesting, there is Naqib's findings or contribution, but he made reference to the effort by Ungku Aziz. It was Ungku Aziz, his cousin, who in late 1984 showed me a manuscript in his personal possession, which he had recently purchased from Mr. Bashir Muhammad, a dealer in London. You see? So the interest of Ungku Aziz, this economist, talks about or made effort to collect some old Malay manuscript, and one of the manuscripts found, incidentally, was the oldest known Malay manuscript, Aqaid of Nasafi, translation. This is just an example. I mean, let me. I'm not too structured. I'm not Professor Zulkifli, cannot complain. I'm not too structured in my initial discussion, because so many things to talk about Ungku Aziz. No? Okay. He introduced books. He always made the point. You know, of course we got close to him. I mean, I met, I can't say hundreds, but many meetings as a student leader, quarreling with him, storming to his office, or invited for dinner in his Vice Chancellor's residence, and as the youth leader in ABIM and in Malaysia Youth Council, invited him to be guest speakers. Even as Minister of Education, invited him for some of the training programs and seminar on educational reform, and Aziz has always been the major speaker, and although he was a bit more guarded in his position as Vice Chancellor, he always promote critical thinking, always challenge students to question some of what is called the normative understanding of issues, although he always cautioned us against more radical position, partly because he was already partly in establishment. You know, Vice Chancellor is quite, particularly those days, very much in the establishment. But he for example, he also promote publication, very active in promoting, introducing books. René Debray, the French philosopher, and here, Weapons of the Weak, Scott, a study in rural Kedah. So you can, to me, exception of Ungku Aziz is partly a scholar, a teacher, but also a public intellectual. In the sense, he wanted the students to be more active, to inculcate this culture of reading, knowledge, and would even challenge some of the conservative interpretation, either of religion or culture. Now, having said that, I had some difficult encounters, because whilst accepting the importance of the English language, there was a period when we have a large number of students, Malay students, from the Malay stream, aliran kebangsaan those days, who entered the university and stuck to an entirely English program. So Ungku Aziz, of course, had problems to navigate this complex issue. So we challenged him, therefore, to take some more drastic measures to ensure that the Malay students from the Malay stream are not being discriminated. Of course, some of my colleagues, the non-Malays, until now think that Anwar becomes virtually the Malay nationalist championing the Malay language. Yes, I did, because to me it's a matter of justice. I was never anti-English. I thought English must be a very important language in the university. But to deny students who have been exposed to only Malay language in the education system, and then compel them to study English without any preparatory program, either those days a matriculation or intensive English program prior to the entrance into the universities, is grossly unjust. So we had to fight. So there was a case even storming into his office and having a dialogue, which went after years. Of course, I felt sad, because this is a great man that we respect immensely, and we had to deal with the situation, although it's not entirely his fault because we were actually against a government policy. Now, and then I became Minister of Education. As Minister of Education, I have this quarterly meeting with Vice Chancellors. And can you imagine? I have to tell them about policies, about programs. And there was an occasion where I was a bit more critical about the declining standard of education generally, and introduced this Educational Commission report, A Nation at Risk, United States study analysis about a risk to education, to the nation, the United States, because of the declining standards of education. So when I challenged that, of course, coming from me, much younger, I was probably about 40, and having to deal with all the senior professors and vice chancellors. But he showed a lot of tolerance and understanding and patience, and continued to have a very healthy and reasoned discourse. But the unfortunate thing that I had to do was, as Minister of Education, there was a period where, because the maximum age at that time as a Vice Chancellor or in the public office, and I could not extend. I did bring up the matter because of the age bar to the cabinet then, but then Prime Minister, the cabinet said, look, we have to change substantially the rule before we could do this, and therefore it was one of my unfortunate role as a minister to inform Professor Diraja Ungku Aziz that I can't extend your tenure as Vice Chancellor. But Alhamdulillah, we continue to have good relations, healthy debates, the issue of Vietnam, issue of Islamization. We brought in scholars like Ismail Farouqi, and which he welcomed. I brought in Yusuf Qaradawi at that time to University of Malaya, and then he gave enough support that Sheikh Yusuf Al-Qaradawi was able to meet all the senior professors in the university in a session, something like that. But frankly, because of the initial wave of Islamic awareness and da'wah, and there was not naturally a very close affinity with Ungku Aziz, because he was a Malay intellectual that see this new trend as something not usual, certainly not in the mainstream. In the University of Malaya, for example, you don't have da'wah. Those days, da'wah is only in the pondok. So I can understand that, but it did not cause any dissension or enmity or rancor between us. But then naturally, I was seen to be, representing a different trend in the campus and in the youth movement. But all said and done, I would say that in conclusion, that it would be a major tragedy for this generation, for students, if you do not attempt to grasp and have some understanding about the greatness, his contribution. To my mind, firstly, of course, in economy, because he was one major pillar at that time, other than Hussein Ali, who talked about the issue of social stratification or inequality and abject poverty in our myth. The consciousness, the ta'iyya among the general student population those days change because of their effort in inculcating this awareness that these university students, should not rest on their laurels and disconnect with the stark realities affecting our population. He supported, for example, PBIUM. Just before me, they had a seminar on rural Malay problems or issues. He was instrumental in supporting it. By the time I took over as PBMUM president, then we were championing the cause of language and education and poverty and corruption. He could not be seen to be totally in support of our efforts, but he was very tolerant, having to navigate between government, which was not too supportive or a bit oppressive, and students, which was then rising in their terms of temperature and demand. So he had, I must say, that a very, very difficult tenureship as a vice chancellor. But he did not just concede like what we see today. For example, when the Ministry of Education then, or the authorities, Home Affairs, insisted that they should interfere in students' program or bar leaders from speaking, he would not consent to that. He said, within this university is my forte and my responsibility. Unless you take a major security measure, like the budding issue, which is 1974. 1974, not 71. December 1974. I remember well because I went in because of that. So I think academics, intellectuals, university administrators must also really try and appreciate. Once you take over that sort of responsibility, you are expected to then conduct your affairs respecting academic freedom, although you are also subjected to the national laws and rules. But then you must try and preserve this, because otherwise universities becomes like a normal secondary school.
Correct.
In Ungku Aziz's period that we had these great economic debates, it was he who initiated the great economic debates, where annually at Dewan to Chancellor, University of Malaya, you can have all sorts of people from all parties, all walks of life, coming and debating, making sure that thousands of students listen to all views. So thank you for giving me this rare opportunity. I'm always great, excited to be back in the UIA or IIU. It is just like I feel it's a part of me, and I must say that I'm very pleased, because when you talk about such an intellectual discourse, is very much in tandem with the thinking, with the ideals and expressed by the great Professor Almarhum Ungku Aziz.
Correct.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. You mentioned just now that you're sorry to Dr. Zul because you're not that structured. But actually, I understand, because when you read about Pak Ungku, there's just so many things to talk about. This is an intellectual. He's also the vice president at the time. He has contribution in public, in economic, and you mentioned quite a few times just now about poverty and how he championed about that. And Alhamdulillah, I think today, what the introduction that Datuk Sri Anwar Ibrahim has given us is basically the layout of what you will be listening more, except the in-depth. So moving forward, because you mentioned that just now, he's such a voracious reader. Now, some believe that he read more than anyone else in Malaysia during his time. So my second question would be that...
More than him.
Okay. I'm putting you guys in the top 3, inshallah. It's a good thing to be competitive on. Now, maybe Datuk Sri is the main leader, but scratch that out. He had his love. He had his love, like you mentioned just now, for Ibn Khaldun work. Muqaddimah, he mentioned that is a must read. Jalaluddin Rumi and Al-Ghazali, and there's no doubt that this great man was a result of his obsession and knowledge of all of these scholars that he chose to shape his thinking. Now, in your opinion, Datuk Sri, because most of us that watch today are students, what makes a man to be very self-driven towards ilm, that they stay curious and inquisitive for his whole life and apply his knowledge on top of that? And how do we produce more individuals of such criteria that not just love knowledge, but share them around and actually implement that in their life?
Well, Ungku Aziz, I mean, as you know, comes from an aristocratic class in Johor. So you see, we have Dato' On Jaafar, the uncle, Naqib Al-Atas, his cousin, Hussein Al-Atas, another cousin. So, I mean, not only is a normal feudal warlords or aristocratic class, but they were intellectuals in their own right. I mean, Dato' On, who had some also influence, immense influence over Ungku Aziz, was a great Malay, not only political leader, but great Malay intellectual, voracious reader. And you see in his lectures and writings, coming from, say, in the 40s and the 50s, to my mind, is still remarkable as a Malay thinker and leader. And I think that sort of a tradition and culture also helped mold the man, you know. We know all of us are not really necessarily fortunate to have that sort of upbringing, but nonetheless, he should be the a figure that could inculcate the same interest and spirit within us. I mean, we came, for example, in our student days, not very many people even know who Ungku Aziz was. Then he was his vice chancellor, and then naturally people get more interested in the issues raised, and through seminars, through discussions, through debates, then we started with discussion on group discussion. We started and then choosing relevant books other than the normal university course or curriculum. Then before even Usrah was introduced in this country, you see. So I think to look at purely from the upbringing of Ungku Aziz may be a bit different, because they had a unique sort of influence, which is not the usual experience or advantage to most Malay families. Yeah? But then that should not be an excuse, because we are, as students, now having the same opportunity. Probably we began a bit later. They may begin when they were 10 or 11. We begin probably when we were 17 or 18. But that would not deter us from this focus and to inculcate that sort of interest and spirit. Inshallah.
Correct. I think students today are interested on discussion. We see that everywhere in social media, except that I think the source of information and the things that we use to discuss on the topic, or basically the idea, I think probably that's when a lot of us get into confusion, because like in the world right now, like so many infos come at once, and there's no longer, the traits of knowledge that was used to be very appreciated back then. Now, moving forward, you smiled very widely when Dr. Zul just now mentioned about mahasiswa menggugat on how written by Muhammad Abu Bakar, and in the forward by Pak Ungku, he mentioned that there was 2 persons that he hoped to write an autobiography of themselves, which is you yourself and Syed Hamid Ali. And at the time, he was the Vice Chancellor of University of Malaya, and you were a very strong face of student activists. I believe most student activists today, even being, we're always being told of that story. And at that time also is the time when AMSU was abolished, and then things were changed to MPP, and then come in AUKU and all sort of things. So can you share with us what was the dynamic like, between someone who held the main position in university administration with student movement, and what was it about student union back then that was so powerful, and that that student union today can emulate? And to give some context, most people usually see that student movement and administration or the government are like a contradict force. So should it stay like that? How do we move forward? How does Pak Ungku behave and show and tolerate? And how do you think it should be now? Now that we are back, student union are back, alhamdulillah.
I'm sure Amir can expound this better, but I believe that we can also share the experience with the past. One is, of course, the tradition of scholarship. People tend to confuse the fact that it is just radicalism or sloganeering, whether it's Islam or Malay culture or nationalism, but without being immersed in understanding and knowledge, not just the 14 or 21 words in Twitter, is real understanding. That would help. That's why I mentioned the space given by Ungku Aziz to the series of seminars. And we were fortunate those days too. You know, we have Zain Abdul Wahid, Najib Alatas, Hussein Alatas, who came down from Singapore. Then we have Kuke Kim. We have quite a number of scholars that and professors who were part of the struggle, who wanted the students to not necessarily to emulate them, but to create this critical awareness. So I think issue of critical thinking, to my mind, is is the essence. People view education as just assimilation of knowledge. I think we require critical thinking. The failure, to my mind, the tragedy in the Muslim world, naturally, even in our country, when you talk about Islam, is more rhetorical without a full grasp and understanding of issues of society. And so if you look at Mahasiswa Menggugat, probably it's a different tradition. People ask me, can we do this? No, not necessarily. I would say that those days there was issue of identity, issue of hopelessness, issue of marginalization. We felt that, you know, there is the sense of the society or the leadership ignoring the sentiments, aspirations of the vast majority. So issue of corruption, of people, leaders enriching themselves is not new. We could even see those days. But I think it has become worse, because in those days probably we're talking about 1 or 2 million, and now we're talking about 100 and 200 million. And so the students have a role. Have a proper understanding, get the facts right, read as much as possible, initiate discourse, challenge these norms, and then proceed to whatever necessary demands or action that you feel need to be done. Ungku Aziz was about this role. I would certainly appreciate his difficulty. How does he navigate looking at the less tolerant government with authoritarian streak, and him, a public intellectual, a social critic, who not necessarily condemn, but very critical of our economic policies, the marginalization of our societies, and some of the massive programs, the Muda scheme. I can remember lots of writings, literature that he has done, he has worked, which would open up and create a better understanding and awareness. And he gave that space. Now, I think if you ask me seriously, and I did discuss this, I remember a lecture that he gave in the University Pertanian those days. And after the lecture, we sat with him for hours. And we always challenge him, Ungku. I always call him Professor. Professor, why are you not writing as much? You know, essential writings on Ungku Aziz, there is certainly a deficit with his grand ideas and schemes and understanding and scholarship. You don't find. I mean, these are, you know, Jejak Pemerintahan Zaman is a great book, but certainly is small compared to his capacity. The collection of his numerous, these are all essays and articles. His idea, his reply was standard, which I use now. I know, why you're not writing? It's all here, but I'll write. So Ungku Aziz said that the time I was a student leader, then the youth leader, then the minister, then opposition leader. This is here, and I'll write. So if you ask me, I think I will follow Ungku Aziz. He's here and I will write at the right time. But it's of course a polite criticism of Ungku Aziz because he did not, craft which I believe would have been immensely useful our society and for my generation and your generation. But for student leaders, Brother Ameh, the challenge is of course to create this awareness. I mean, you have limitations. If a leader is corrupt, you talk about corruption, you upset him. If the leader has the authoritarian streak or unjust, you talk about justice, they think it's a challenge to their rule. The idea is, so you must understand that. There's no two way about it. You just like Amar Ma'ruf Nahi Munkar. Your duty is to undertake that effort to create awareness. That's why the key word, the key phrase is critical thinking and awareness.
Thank you so much, Dr. Sri. Unfortunately, we don't get more of the writing of Pak Ungku like you wish it to be, but we hope that your generation and you yourself, inshallah, would put more of your thinking into writing to benefit my generation and future to come, inshallah. Now, among the things, moving forward to this question, among the things that you can easily notice about Pak Ungku is his deep love for Malay custom. You mentioned just now, and I also mentioned about pantun, the Melayu Johor Ghazal. He largely contributed towards Museum Seni Asia. He made Hamzah Dolmat to record 218 pieces of classical Malay, including Ghazal, and 247 of Keroncang numbers in University Malaya Library. He was proud and vocal about empowering Bahasa and Kesatuan Melayu. So what I can derive from all of this is that he is very self-aware of his identity and what is truly meant to be a Malay Muslim or like a Malaysian. So, and he seems to be a man that is very proud of his culture and or like the man of the culture. So I believe this is also what drives him to, to have as much as contribution towards his land and Malaysian in general. So my question is, why is it important for a man to be very connected with his culture and custom or budaya? And do you agree that most of the younger generations today have lost the touch of what it meant to be a Malaysian, that we are no longer proud? And what exactly are we presenting? Sometimes we no longer even know what are we presenting as a culture.
Culture and tradition, you see. He is a public intellectual, a known international figure, a great economist, but he's rooted in his culture and tradition. You see? We have these so-called intellectuals or the ruling clique that's completely uprooted. No, virtually nothing, show no interest in their own culture and tradition. And they pretend to be championing the Malays. I don't know what they want to champion. They don't even understand Malay classics, Malay culture, Malay society, Malay music, and they pretend to champion. I don't know what they want to champion, and certainly not Malay economy, except their economy. So I think what he has done, for example, you mentioned Ghazal, Hamzah Dolmat, Ghazal because he's Johorian, you see, but this is a great contribution, and if you look at the whole Ministry of Culture and the Arts, they cannot compete what he has done. He had this vision, and because of the lack of interest or focus by the institutions and agencies, he has to undertake his personal and also the university responsibility. He was criticized, I remember, at that time. Personalities in the Ministry of Education or in the government. What business he has to do? He is a vice chancellor. He is an economist. He has to just focus on what he needs to do. But no, Ungku Aziz differ, because university is university. The whole concept of kulliyah, that the wholeness, and of course the arts, culture, and the classics. I remember when I was, again, Minister of Finance, when I embarked on this Malay Classic series, Yayasan Karyawan, to reprint and continue research on even the old hikayat, starting from Hikayat Hang Tuah and series of all the sejarah Melayu and the rest. Then we had people like Muhammad Haji Saleh and Nik Safia. I had a session with Ungku Aziz to seek his views and advice. And he was, of course, thrilled with this. He says, "No, we talk about the great books series. America has the great books. UK has Encyclopedia Britannica. So we do not have a compendium and a collection of Malay classics that could be recommended as the great book series." So I then initiated to have this Malay and then to extend it to the Islamic world, so that our young intellectuals are equally familiar with our culture and tradition, and also the universal Islamic view of the world, from Al-Ghazali to Al-Biruni to Iqbal to Muhammad Nasir, etc. So I think that is the I think exceptional contribution. Not very many. I'm not saying that nothing's being done. There were efforts later on at the UKM. I'm aware of it, and we had plans with our brother Abdul Hamid Abu Sulaiman. I think when I was president, to embark on this collection of Islamic arts and culture within the Malay world. Because we did not succeed, then I had to rest in this bamboo. They call it Bamboo River, Sungai Buloh. But what Ungku Aziz achieved, again, I think is remarkable. Is not only unprecedented, but unrivaled in this country. You talk about his collections and his efforts, which goes beyond the scope of academia in a narrow sense, or scholarship, but this is talking about the classics. Now, how do we then encourage the young intellectuals to be a bit interested? I mean, I leave it to the professors. I leave it to the student body. I mean, you must then encourage. Let us look at the museum or the collection. Go to University of Malaya. Look, you talk really serious. Trying to understand who Ungku Aziz is. Go to University of Malaya and look at some of his what he left in terms of the arts or culture or scholarship.
Thank you so much, Datuk Sri. I agree very much, because I think even to a certain extent, we are more introduced towards English classics compared to our own classics, even starting from school or like university sometimes. So I hope that can happen. And you mentioned just now that my name is Farida Hanum. There's a hikayat on Farida Hanum myself. My name is Farida Hanum, Datuk Sri. Tapi
Syekh Al-Hadi, you know the original title of Farida Hanum? Setia, Asyik dan Maksyuknya.
Okay.
Early shares are quite romantic.
Except that I'm Farida Hanim. Kukala Hanum tu kan. Okay. Alright. So still on the topic of knowledge and interdisciplinary knowledge, because when you talk about Pak Ungku, he tapped into so many things, and this is what we call interdisciplinary of knowledge. And his knowledge goes beyond economic development, but also like includes literature, education, and his love for culture. So he always encouraged students to recognize different disciplines apart from their main courses. So how do you think a university can be more successful in producing cross-disciplinary knowledge students?
You see, what he encouraged and what we did is, for example, you talk about a seminar on rural poverty, okay? Then students from engineering faculty, the arts, economics, and medicine are all encouraged to attend, okay? So you are actually exposed to this. And now I think a similar position. You talk about climate change. People in the arts tradition would have some difficulty because of the technical subject, but then they should be encouraged to go to understand, because these are of issues, universal concern. I think this is where the university can then encourage student leaders to start initiating these programs. Not sufficient unless we can encourage students from various disciplines to start this sort of healthy intellectual discourse in these subjects. And actually students have this, huge capacity to understand. I mean, we thought that the great economic debates at that time, students were discussing, very, very substantive economic issues. Then we have a huge conference on Bahasa and Sastra and Malay education, and corruption, of course, landless farmers. So I mean, and you talk about landless farmers, you talk about land reform, you talk about the issue of land. So you must expose them, but always allow backup. Now those days we have short pamphlets to accompany these seminars. Now probably with the social media and more so with the technology, I think through whatever apps we can probably disseminate this sort of information.
Thank you so much, Datuk Sri. I think it will be nice for us to have, law student discussing with economic student, make something together, right? Correct. Like that rarely happened more today. And I think it's also very Islamic. If you look at our Islamic scholars, most of them, they do not just, they're not just expert in one field of knowledge, but in so many things. They're mathematicians at the same time as they're also, doctors and health experts and all the stuff. Now, before I move to my question, I would like to invite everyone who is watching us today to leave any kind of questions that you have on the comment below. We will pick the most interesting one, inshallah, by the end of this discussion. So make sure do not make your curiosity, translate your curiosity into a legit question. Then, inshallah, Datuk Sri can answer anything. Now, moving forward, my question is on we cannot have a conversation about Pak Ungku. You also mentioned this just now. We don't mention his contributions towards the marginalized group, and he was renowned in the field of rural poverty, and and it led to his brilliant idea of creation of Tabung Haji. He suggested Howard Project in 1977 to ensure the well-being of a woman, rural urban migrant workers in grasping industrial employment at the time. He often emphasized that development cannot solely be viewed in economic progress, but also on the repercussion for the people affected by the development. Hence why he highlighted the need to protect all of these marginalized and vulnerable groups. Now, in your opinion, how well do you see the government today has been doing, or generally in all kind of sector? How well have Malaysia have been in protecting these marginalized and vulnerable groups?
I see Dr. Zulkifli is smiling because it's a highly politically loaded question. No, I think
intellectual discourse,
yeah, I know. I'm just joking. Look, we need a reasoned discourse, which means whatever we do, what we will say, will be backed with facts and arguments. And in this case, for example, in Parliament I say the same thing. 59, 60, 61, Ungku Aziz wrote, you see, and this is not jejak, rencana kemiskinan. Hussein Ali talk about social stratification, poverty and inequality in 61. But still, that is largely again denied and ignored. Why is that so? But my criticisms are not only the political leadership, about the intellectuals. I have a huge debate about the so-called urban elite. They talk about, of course, human rights and issues, fair, but you hardly hear them talking about urban poor and the rural poor. The fact that they do not have the opportunity to compete. You talk about justice. Where is the justice when you don't allow people to give to compete on a level playing field? You talk about meritocracy, fair, okay? You give them equal opportunities and let them compete. How do you then compete between a school in Manik Urai and a school in Kuala Lumpur? I mean, at least the premier schools, or where I come from, Malay College Kuala Kangsar. You can't. Therefore, justice, I mean, I believe student leaders could discuss this further. You know, what is adl in Islam, okay, and or justice in even a Western understanding must be of fairness. You know, you can't otherwise discuss this as just a political slogans. You know? And that's why, to me, as student leaders, although I would say that they're welcome to join keadilan, but to my mind, what's more important is they, as student leaders, they should not have this cult, personality, or this obsession with leaders until you can't question. It's just voila, whatever the leader says, you must follow. I mean, that's not the tradition of scholarship that we're talking about. So you ask me about the present regime, I would question the legitimacy in the first place. More so now, when they declared emergency, 115 members of parliament have rejected or have asked to review or asked the parliament to be convened. 115 out of 220. The majority have rejected the government rule. They have lost the majority. When a democratic government loses its majority, it's considered already illegitimate. Okay, notwithstanding that, let us look at the policies. What is the educational policy? You look, I was in Port Dickson last weekend. You talk about online learning. You talk about, for the last 1 year, buying computers or tablets for students is not forthcoming, and now they say it's on loan. So we had to raise money, ask the private sector and collect funds to buy tablets for the poor. So what's happening now in education, in health, in economy, with graduate unemployment, young graduates, 60, 70,000 just unemployed, and unemployment which has gone to 800,000 on record, I'm sure much more, then there's going to be abject poverty, increasing numbers of the poor, and growing disparity and inequality. You don't need to read Thomas Piketty to understand what inequality is, because there is enough literature, even by our scholars, talking about this. I'm not suggesting you shouldn't read Piketty. You must. I mean, I have the book here, in case somebody wants to borrow. But my point is this. When you have a crisis, pandemic, COVID-19, and as a result, economic downturn, then you must have bold programs to address this issue. You can't be talking about no tender, your commissions, more ministers, more allowance for them. I mean, this is ridiculous. You don't have the habits of the heart and concern for the welfare of the people. And this, to my mind, is disturbing. So, of course, I say this was Anwar's opposition leaders, political, but you challenge these facts. Why did we oppose the Belanjawan, the budget, last year? Because they claim that the budget is COVID-19 budget. But in reality, no. They create huge political posts by the hundreds of millions of ringgit for political posts, for political positions. When people are struggling even to eat and live. I see I'm getting angry and passionate about this subject. Why? Ungku Aziz told me since 1961 about the plight of the rural poor. And who are we to blame? And therefore, students must take up these issues. Not necessarily to be, people say of course it's political. What is an education policy if it's not political? Or health, or COVID-19, or you see the MCO. You change rules every day. I was on my way to Port Dickson and back, and the police checkpoint. I said, apa khabar cik? Everything semua okay? Dia okay Tok Seri, tapi tak tahulah rule mana nak pakai. Bukan hari-hari tukar rule. You know? And there's no clarity. There's no thinking. You know, and it's haphazard. Even in dealing with COVID-19. And there's no transparency. We asked about COVID-19. Vaccine. How much does it cost? What are the companies? What are the relative price compared to what other countries are getting? Why Indonesia is getting Sinovac? Why are not we getting? No answers. Yours is not to question why, but do and die. So I mean, this is what is to me exasperating. It's more than this, just disconcerting, because you see these very issues, yeah, and when we question, we say, well, we're on a pandemic. This is an emergency. You know, we have to deal with it, and don't create a political problem. You can have. You can go to restaurants now. You can have meetings. You can have whatever. You can't convene parliament. Does it make sense? You can do virtually everything now, although it's called emergency, but parliament cannot be on session. Why? Emergency. I mean, if students and student leaders, do not appreciate these problems, I'm at a loss, because I think we must take a position and voice out. I mean, how, what, it's up to you to decide in the present generation. Like this, Undi 18. Okay, can you imagine? This was agreed by all parties. You see, government and opposition. Oh, there are people about 18 who are not smart enough to understand politics. I am telling you, there are people who are 60 or 70 who have no understanding of what politics is all about, who can't even recognize the symbol. Okay, then why then you deny the younger guys the right to vote, and giving this argument they do not understand? I rest my case.
It's very okay to be angry, Datuk Sri, because like I agree when you said that we cannot separate politics in anything at the end of the day today. Like, so I personally believe that there's nothing that should be too sensitive to be talking about. And I think because this culture of everything is too sensitive to be talking about, that we are not evolved, and students don't think that they can do more than what they can do now. My last question before I give all of the questions to the audience is that Pak Ungku is an academician. At his time, his idea of tabung haji is a breakthrough and bizarre idea in Islamic countries. He is an academician, but at the same time, he applies and actually put things into practical. Like he actually practiced it. But looking at today, we have Majlis Professor Negara and have so many academicians. But how well do you think have they been serving as an academician? Why can't we produce more people like Pak Ungku? Like, are we lack of incentive towards our academicians? Why is it? Why aren't we letting our academicians contribute more than just theories and teaching in general?
Well, Ungku Aziz, of course, as public intellectual, it's just not. I mean, I don't expect all academicians to be able to articulate on all the other policies or issues. Some are pure researchers or teachers. Fine, I think we have to accept and acknowledge that. But we must, you are right, Faida, that you must actually produce more scholars who have empathy for the rakyat and for all societal concerns. That is, if you can Google, this called a Wreath Lecture by Edward Said on the role of public intellectuals. The brilliant, I should say, analysis or attempt to explain the role of an intellectual to speak the truth, to articulate their views and position with courage, And otherwise you become, you remember this Julian Benda about the treason of intellectuals. It's not a new thing. You know, she considered this as a treason because you have intellectuals that people look up to, but you fail to articulate issues and represent and say the truth and represent the conscience of your people. There is of course a difference, because I think among students and student leaders, we also must represent the conscience, hati nurani of the rakyat. And we should, I mean, it's not fair to say not we don't have. Of course, the statue of Ungku Aziz, or we recently discussed Hussein Alatas, or Naqib Alatas. They are exceptions. Okay, I don't think that we can, in one generation, produce so many of the level of these scholars. But certainly we should attempt in our own way to endeavor to do more, to articulate issues, and to have empathy. And this can be done, and it is happening, but I think more need to be done. Of COVID-19, you remember the Academy of Science took a strong position. It's a departure from the conventional thinking of the Ministry of Health, and calls upon the government to consider some of these issues of concern. I mean, it's courageous on their part, and I think if I were in the government, I think we'd at least take into consideration some of their views. These are experts in their own right, expressing concern for the welfare of our society and country.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Dr. Sri. I like that you mentioned that even at this student level, we should have this compassionate and empathetic spirits. That is very true. I think all of this conversation lead me to this, one of my teachers that always said to me, the best of mankind, it is actually hadith, the best of mankind is he who contribute the most to others, to help others the most. And hopefully every one of us, in any kind of things that we do, even if we're not academicians or students or anything, can contribute the most towards other people and be more empathetic in doing that. Now, changing the focus towards the audience that have been, booming with so many questions, I'm picking one of it. First question by Idayu Mumtaz. Recently, economist Dr. Khalid said young graduates become among the most vulnerable groups due to the pandemic. Students struggle to help themselves before they could even help the society. What do you think is the role of the student leadership in this crisis, and what do you think Prof Ungku might say?
Ungku Aziz didn't see the impact of the pandemic, but he has always been talking about poverty, unemployment, mismatch between academic discipline and the requirement of society. Notwithstanding that, education must still be wholesome and encompassing. So what do we do? The government, for example, must have a proper plan. How do you deal with unemployment? So you have a prime minister saying, we have a new digital plan. In the next 20 years, we have now 100,000 new jobs to be created. Okay? They have said that 2 years ago. They said that 10 years ago when it comes to digitalization. But we want to know, how do you open up investments, domestic and foreign investments? People will come only to invest if they have confidence and legitimacy and stability of the government. We don't have. And many of the industries now are leaving. Huge industries are leaving. What does, for example, the leaders say? Malaysia will remain very important hub for investments in the region. What are they talking about? I mean, you know that major companies are leaving. Okay, I'm not saying that no investments coming in, but of course it's small, very small. So, given the situation pandemic, there must be clear policies to encourage investments, both domestic and international, foreign direct investments. Then there must be a calculated, a planned attempt to open some of the sectors, including tourism. You can have effective, tough SOPs. You can demand that everyone use the mask. Okay? I don't dispute that. You can have strict enforcement. Okay? But you must not stop economic activity. Because we have to balance. We are talking about pandemic. Yes, you die of pandemic. But you don't want people to die of hunger. You have people, small petty traders in the warungs, not working for months. What happened? The whole family is just done. Education. We have lost one whole year. And there's no plan, no clear direction. What do we do? And who the adverse impact will be the poor, urban poor and the rural poor, irrespective of race. So I would say if you start opening up, then there becomes more avenues for people to seek jobs. And of course, that would include graduates. And to suggest that people are choosy is no longer true. You have pilots opening mini stalls. You have, graduates, Uber drivers, or Panda Food, whatever. You find them all over. People are just craving just to survive. But there must be a plan. You must see leaders and ministers in action. Now we have leaders MIA, missing in action.
Correct, Dr. Sri. I feel very related to this as well. I think recently I am also lost one of our brothers because when he want to gain extra money from Food Panda and then he got into an accident. So and he's just one of the stories of so many more that face the trouble of this, and we really do hope that there is some kind of policy and incentive to really that we can really see, they are actually listening and seeing these things are actually happening. Moving forward, a question from Yusuf Ismail. In summary, what might be Pak Ungku's overall perceptions towards he mentioned specifically the Malay students in terms of A, academic achievement, B, concern towards the society, and C, leadership potential to lead the nation responsibly?
No. You can read some of his works where he would insist on scholarship. I mean, level of understanding, grasping of issues. So I think for the general Malays, I'm sure Malaysians at large, must be this understanding. And you inculcate the strong sense of character, discipline, incorruptibility to become true leaders. And Ungku Aziz does not speak that much of corruption, but if you look at the jejak and some of his writings, of course, he's very critical of the abuse of power, the waste which is due to corruption. And I think he would then want the young students to inculcate this habit, this awareness, and this idealism to embark on reform, for the country, for the society, to rid the country of corruption and abuse and plain ignorance. You must. We enough Malays who are qualified. That's why I have picked. I wrote this review of Tommy Thomas' book. Not necessarily that I disagree with most issues said, but some of the issues, for example, against the Aegis Chamber or against the civil servants, you can't just generalize that normally officer is competent. That sort of a narrow prejudice is not acceptable. I am against racism, the Malay discriminatory practice against non-Malays, or the non-Malays prejudice, whether it is subconscious or not. Because you have actually some outstanding, my experience as a minister for 10 years, there were some outstanding bureaucrats, scholars. We have some outstanding academicians. We have, professors or lecturers who are really committed, who love the students and scholarship and the university. And I think we must take cognizance of this and cannot generalize. We should blame the leaders for appointing the mediocre semi-literate ones. So why blame the rakyat?
Okay, next question. A simple question by Ahmad Salami. What are your advices for CSOs and NGOs to be vigilant for check and balance in these non-functioning policymakers currently under this new government?
Well, Ahmad, my positions, I said before, critical thinking, create the awareness, have a better understanding of issues, and have the courage to articulate. If you start talking about what happens this, what if the law, what will this fellow say, then you do nothing. See, courage is also important. But before that, you must have the character and the commitment, understanding. That's why the tradition of knowledge, what Franz Rosenthal talking about Ibn Khaldun, talking about knowledge triumphant, is important. That tradition of triumphalism of knowledge, not of ego, not of wealth, not of class, but of knowledge is important. But in Islam, as you know, is also ilm and akhlaq. It's a character, a shakhsiyah, Islamiyah, ma'nawiyah, which means you must inculcate correct values and character that inculcate truth, have this compassion, belief in justice, and have strong moral precept, and of course against this trend of rampant corruption and moral decadence in our society.
Okay, last question, Datuk Sri. This is fairly. A question from Alif Naif. My opinion, Datuk Sri, the government should always empower civil society in combating poverty. The impersonal relationship between certain government and the common rakyat creates a certain tension while combating poverty and implementing policy. Would love to hear your thoughts on civil societies and policy.
In fact, when I wrote the Renaissance, I talk about Madani, Al-Mujtama' Al-Madani, Madani society, not limited to civil societies. I understanding of civil society with strong ethical values, with commitment, with compassion. And it's important because the whole Islamic tradition is the civil society and the Waqf, which is essentially civil society. All these associations of Waqf that built universities and hospitals under Waqf. And even in the West, if you read one of the popular literature that I encourage, Democracy in America, Alexis de Tocqueville, he talks about intermediate associations, which those days, of course, there's no terminology about civil society as such, but intermediate associations. One is the government, the other is the people. Okay, but there's intermediate associations that could interact and understand, empathize with the people, but at the same time can then relate and influence or at least present the case to the authorities or the government. So the role of the student bodies, NGOs, civil societies, Waqf, mosque committees, You don't limit, or PIBGs. These are, to me, essential in any vibrant democracy. Of a government that is autocratic, that's scared of the aspirations of the people, would certainly do everything possible to discourage this. A fair democratic government would certainly encourage this, because it would help and immensely the whole exercise of getting people's views into account, and therefore being able to pressurize or influence the direction of society. Otherwise, without these intermediate associations or madani, masyarakat madani, mujtama' madani, then you will not have this advantage of government having to listen and the civil society having to empathize. Again, I reiterate the point that in Muslim societies of the past, the civil society, madani or waqaf institutions made these enormous contributions. Fazlur Rahman, in his one of his works, Islam and Modernity, if I'm not mistaken, mentioned Indonesia as an example. You know, the hundreds of institutions, universities, a few hospitals, of course, but mainly schools and universities, by this Nahdlatul Ulama and Muhammadiyah, you know, to the extent that they can really mobilize the support of the poor to build these institutions. I'm not saying that here we should all do that. We can do that, but there are areas where the government have the capacity. They started because under the Dutch there was nothing done, and initial decades after independence in Indonesia, the economic policy was severely flawed. So the role of civil institutions, civil society, is more relevant, more pressing as compared to the present. But I would certainly end by encouraging students to use this opportunity. IIU remains a great academic institution. I'm a bit biased. I remember when I was Minister of Education, Minister of Finance, some of the other vice chancellors were very critical. He says, Anwar, just only look at the university, Islamic university. It's not true, because I take care of all universities. But I have great hopes that this institution will produce not only quality scholarship, but also students with great empathy. Because rarely do you find students having understanding about Africa and Middle East, and because they are there, students, more so in the past, less so now, but still you have students, and because by nature you have friends from these countries, your understanding is just like traveling to these countries. So thank you very much again for this opportunity, and Zul, Zikifli, thank you for your patience. I hope you don't get too many questions from authorities. It's not your fault, it's my fault, because I'm supposed to speak on Renaissance and the Renaissance man, but then I have to also venture into some other questions which I think relevant to the articulation and the works of our marhum Ungku Aziz. Terima kasih banyak.
Thank you so much, Datuk Sri. I hope everyone who are with us tonight benefit from this discussion. Like Datuk Sri mentioned, I think the first thing that we should do now is equip ourselves with knowledge, and with what we already have, inshallah, contribute as much as we can at our capacity. Unfortunately, we have to end this discussion now. I will gladly give one last pantun before we turn off. Bunga dedap di atas para, ada anak susun pasang pelita. Kalau tersilap tutur bicara, jemari disusun, maaf dipinta. Thank you so much, everyone. Have a very good night. Datuk Sri, once again, thank you so much. We hope that we have more discussion after this. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh, everyone.